Welcome to the American Humanist Association 80th Annual Conference and our session, The History of Humanism and the AHA. We're so glad you're joining us. I'm Nicole Carr, the Development Director and Conference Organizer for the AHA, and I use she, her pronouns. We have a practice of making land acknowledgements at the beginning of our events, so I'd like to say that here at the AHA headquarters, I'm on the unceded territory of the Piscataway and Nacotchtank or Anacostan people. A few housekeeping announcements. During the session, your microphones will be off, but feel free to introduce yourselves to us and to other participants using the chat function. If you're on your computer, you'll find that on the right side of your screen. Also, we'll do some Q&A at the end of the session, so type any questions you think of in the Q&A section in that same area. If you're on the app on your device, look for the box that says Session Q&A to type your questions. I see we have at least one question there already, so good to know that we're prepared. We're running closed captions for this session, and you can turn them on by clicking Live Transcription and then Enable Subtitles. And you can also turn them off in the same place if you'd rather not see them. Our moderator today will be Fred Edwards, longtime humanist leader and teacher, and he'll introduce you to the rest of the panel. Fred?
Hello and welcome to the panel discussion, The History of Humanism and of the American Humanist Association. I'm Fred Edwards, and I'm your MC. Here we will reveal the historical background of modern humanism and the progress made by the American Humanist Association since its founding 80 years ago. You'll learn who the leaders, activists, and thinkers were, what were the major accomplishments, and where you can go to learn more. Our four panelists, Mandisa Thomas, Annie Laurie Gaylor, John Leaker, and I, will each speak for about 15 minutes. As we go along, please make a note of your questions and direct them as just instructed by Nicole. They can be asked at the end after all four panelists have given their presentations. Our first speaker is Mandisa Thomas. She is president of Black Nonbelievers, an organization she founded in 2011. Its goals include eliminating stigma, increasing visibility, and providing support and networking opportunities around non-belief in the African American community. It has affiliates in 10 US cities. Mandisa also sits on the boards of directors of American Atheists and the American Humanist Association. Welcome, Mandisa.
Thank you very much, Fred, and welcome to everyone who is tuned into the session this evening. As Fred stated earlier, I am Mandisa Thomas. I am the founder and president of Black Nonbelievers, which is headquartered in the Atlanta, Georgia area. I am also currently the vice president of the American Humanist Association. I'm here this evening to speak directly to the contributions of Black humanists in my work in advocacy in the secular movement and as leader of Black Nonbelievers. My work does center around increasing and amplifying the voices of those who still are marginalized even within this community, and from a modern and also historical perspective. And so this evening, I am going to talk a bit more about the role that Black humanists have played in history, as well as within the American Humanist Association. So the title of my talk is Rightful Place, Black Humanism from the Past into the Future. If we could advance to the next slide, please. So one of the first humanists and freethinkers that I'm going to discuss is Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who is a bit outside of the history of the American Humanist Association. However, his contributions and accomplishments are very, very important. If we could advance the cursor, please. He was very active during the Harlem Renaissance period. He is an African-American historian. He was a Harvard graduate. of course, descended from the enslaved people. Uh, is the author of The Miseducation of the Negro, which was published in 1925. Next cursor, please. He is also the founder of Negro History Week in 1926, which later became Black History Month. Now, this is important to not just humanist history and Black history, this is important to American history because Black History Month is still acknowledged to this day. And many people are unaware that its roots are from a historian who was very critical of the institution of religion. And this is very, very important. Dr. Woodson actually criticized the church and religion in The Miseducation of the Negro and also in other works. I highly recommend that if you are not familiar with Dr. Woodson, please become more familiar with his work. He was very, very much an advocate for chronicling and amplifying those voices in the Black community who rightfully deserve them. If we can go to the next slide, please. The next one is Butterfly McQueen, and I'm pretty sure that Annie Laurie will be maybe speaking on her in her presentation, in her segment. Butterfly McQueen, who goes by whose first name was Thelma, who lived from 1911 to 1995, was an actress, famously, if you could advance the cursor, please. She was an actress best known for her role in Gone with the Wind. Next cursor, please. She actually spent her later years working with children and donated her body to medical science. Next cursor, please. She is famously quoted as saying, "As my ancestors are free from slavery, I am free from the slavery of religion." Now, this is very important. Butterfly McQueen was an open and unapologetic atheist. She was honored by the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And this is pretty important. I had the opportunity to partake and participate in this year's Juneteenth celebration in Atlanta, which of course acknowledges the the emancipation of the enslaved, which unfortunately in Texas received that word 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was established. And so on June 19th, which was this year made a federal holiday. For those of you who aren't familiar with Juneteenth, I highly recommend it. However, in Black communities, those celebrations are still highly religious, and so our presence as an organization at this event, I had a special sign made with McQueen's quote because it was very important to show that that non-believers, atheists, and humanists have existed historically within the Black community, and liberation also extends beyond physical enslavement. We also must continue to enforce or advocate for mental liberation, especially from a religious framework. Next slide, please. So now we're going to get into some humanists that are directly related to the American Humanist Association. And we will start with Asa Philip Randolph, also known as A. Philip Randolph, who lived from 1889 to 1979. If you could advance the cursor, please. He is the founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union in 1925. He was also the chief organizer for the 1963 March on Washington. Often, when we think of that monumental event, we think of Dr. Martin Luther King, rightfully so, with the I Have a Dream speech. But oftentimes, we do not acknowledge those who were in the background and who were responsible for putting this event together. And A. Philip Randolph was one of them. He did openly identify as a humanist. And next cursor, please. He was honored as the American Humanist Association's Humanist of the Year in 1970. And from what I understand, he also contributed to one of the Humanist Manifestos. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Next slide, please. We also, this is often, this is a piece of history that often does not get acknowledged. Faye Waddleton, who is also Alice Faye Waddleton, first name, born in 1943 and is still alive. Next cursor, please. She is a pioneering reproductive justice advocate, activist, and practitioner. She received a master's degree in nursing and midwifery and was very, very active in the Harlem area with reproductive justice, especially regarding economically disadvantaged young Black women who did not have access to birth control and adequate reproductive care. Next cursor, please. She was also the president of Planned Parenthood from 1978 to 1992, which grew tremendously under her leadership. Now, in doing some research on Faye Waddleton, she was born in St. Louis, was raised in a religious household. However, reproductive justice and birth control and the reproductive rights became very, very important to her. And I learned that her mother actually disapproved of her work in reproductive health, being a staunch Christian, but she attributed her work in reproductive health to the values that were instilled in her when she was younger. So, and also next cursor, please. She was honored as AHA's Humanist of the Year in 1986. Now, I must point out something very, very important here. In her speech, she did give credit to Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood and who was also a known humanist. However, it must be noted that Margaret Sanger was a product of her time and also did hold some not so favorable views regarding eugenics and also the Black community. And I think that it is important that if we are going to continue to honor these pioneering trailblazers, that we must be honest about the issues of their time and also how they impacted marginalized communities, so that we are not surprised when this information comes up. It is very, very important for us to acknowledge that part of this history, and that no human being is perfect, and that even in their good work, and especially in their non-religious work, that they still held some views that are very controversial. And as a community, it is important for us to at least acknowledge that. And I can appreciate that Faye Waddleton, credited Margaret Sanger with founding Planned Parenthood, as well as being a trailblazer and a Black woman in the area of reproductive justice, which is still a very, very important area within the Black community. Next slide, please. So now we move to some recent AHA Black humanist history, which does include the feature of the 5 Fierce Humanists on the July-August 2018 issue of the Humanist magazine, which includes myself, Sikivu Hutchinson, who is a member of the Black Humanist Alliance, Candace Gorham, who is also a member of the Black Humanist Alliance, Bridget Crutchfield, who is on the board for Black Nonbelievers, and Liz Ross, who is involved with the Black Skeptics Group. This is the first time that 5 Black women humanists were featured on any cover. Previously, the American Humanist Association featured Alice Walker, who was also honored as Humanist of the Year previously. However, this is the first time that multiple Black humanist women were featured and in a cover story. And also, it is important to note that the 2020 Harvard Humanist of the Year were Sikivu Hutchinson, Ijoma Oluo, who was previously awarded I think in 2018, she might have been, I think she was the Feminist of the Year, and also yours truly. This is the first time, I think, for that particular award, which was co-sponsored by the Humanist Chaplaincy at Harvard and the American Humanist Association, that Black women were given this acknowledgement. So this is very, very important moving into the future, of American humanist history, as well as secular movement history and Black history, because all three are being made at the same time. And this is important to note. Next slide, please. So why is this information important? Oftentimes we hear, why does there need to be a focus on specific demographics? Why does there need to be an organization like Black Nonbelievers, and so on and so forth? First, it is important for us to know that the Black community is not a monolith, even though we are still dealing with a very, very high concentration and population of religious. The Black community never has been and never will be monolithic. So there have always been different perspectives, especially regarding religious thought and lack thereof, and also the history and current presence of Black, Indigenous, people of color in the secular community is still obscured and undervalued. Now, this is very important because while there has been acknowledgement, I do give credit also to the Freedom from Religion Foundation, who has an incredible catalog of free thinkers, especially in their Free Thoughts of the Day, which features quite a few people of color. However, this is still not represented sufficiently in current leadership, and also in paid leadership, and also paid opportunities for people of color in this movement. And if we want this to change, and we want to continue to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, we must be more inclusive in our narrative and our actions. So if we want to continue to attract more people of color, and also to and expand the narrative beyond state-church separation, which also is important and intersectional when it comes to racial justice and economic justice, reproductive justice, and the like, it is important that who is represented, the many faces and also the work of the people of color in this movement are sufficiently represented and supported. And I will go back to the previous, we don't have to go back to the previous slide, but the Five Fierce Humanists issue of the Humanist magazine is what led to the Women of Color Beyond Belief Conference, which debuted in 2019 and is supported, co-sponsored by the Freedom from Religion Foundation and the American Humanist Association, among other organizations. So I hope that you will consider attending this year's event, which will take place in Chicago from September 24th through the 26th. We also have an online streaming option, and you will have the opportunity to hear more women of color, humanists, atheists, freethinkers who are doing important work in this movement. So I will end by saying that it is important for us, again, to continue to look beyond the usual narrative of who we hold in high regard in this community. While there are a number of folks who have done extremely important work, and we certainly do value them, I am proud to say that I am representing a growing demographic in the country as well as in this movement. And the work that we're doing is important to humanist history, the American Humanist Association, Black Nonbelievers, as well as global history, and also global efforts. So I think that ends this presentation. Here's another slide. Yes, so here's some recommended reading. for those who would like to learn more. First is Humanist in the Hood, Unapologetically Black, Feminist, and Heretical by Sikivu Hutchinson, which was released in 2020. You can also, another good book is Black Freethinkers, A History of African American Secularism by Christopher Cameron, which was released in 2019. And there you can read more about historic humanist, atheists, and freethinkers from the time of slavery to the civil rights movement. And it also does include some current leaders in the movement, as well as Dr. Sikivu Hutchinson's book as well. So I'd like to thank you very much. I will turn it back over to Fred to introduce the next panelist.
All right. Thank you, Mandisa. Very informative. All right, our second speaker is Annie Laurie Gaylor. She's author of several books, including Woe to the Women, the Bible Tells Me So, Betrayal of Trust, Clergy Abuse of Children, and as editor, Women Without Superstition, No Gods, No Masters. She and her late mother, Ann Nicole Gaylor, and the late John Sontark founded the Freedom from Religion Foundation in 1978, an organization she now runs as co-president with her husband, Dan Barker. Annie Laurie?
Well, thank you, Fred and Nicole, Emily. Fascinated by your presentation, Mandisa. I used to be a co-chair of what was then the American Humanist Association Feminist Caucus for many years, and I'm pleased to be part of AHA's 80th anniversary conference. First, I would like to single out Vashti McCullum, who was the president of the American Humanist Association from 1962 to 65, I believe, and was the first of what is now 4 women to have so served. And let's go to that second slide. Yeah. And I think actually this might be a picture taken at the American Humanist Association. I'm not sure. And you can see they called her that awful McCullum woman. She is a revered name in the history of constitutional law as well as humanism. Vashti McCullum won a landmark challenge of religion in public schools at the U.S. Supreme Court after what she called 3 years of headlines, headaches, and hatred in 1948. It was the first such case. And she's part of a long line of women humanists, non-believers, freethinkers, secular activists, plaintiffs, women who have led or even started secular organizations. But some of this was lost to history. And I'm not a historian, but I'm going to, and there's no way to wrap this up in 15 minutes, but I'll speak more personally. When my mother and I co-founded the Freedom from Religion Foundation back in 1976, and John Sontark was an elderly man in Milwaukee who kindly lent his name so there wouldn't just be 2 of us who were a mother and daughter. And unfortunately, he died the next year. But when we all co-founded FFRF, we did not know, we were not aware of the existence of another feminist freethinker who had started something very similar in the 1890s. It was a national secular league, the Women's National Liberal Union, with very similar aims to FFRF. And if you show the next slide, it was founded by Matilda Joslyn Gage. Oh, I'm sorry, that's from One Woman's Fight. I don't know my own slides. That's the Supreme Court ruling. And then Matilda Joslyn Gage will come next. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not reading my own stuff. That's my mother, who died in 2015. I just wanted to show her. Now, the next one really will be Matilda Joslyn Gage. One of the resolutions of this liberal league, and liberal used to be a word that was synonymous with free thought, by the way, is so timely. In order to help preserve the very life of the Republic, it is imperative that women should unite upon a platform of opposition to the teaching and aim of that ever most unscrupulous enemy of freedom, the church. Women representing 33 states back in an era when people didn't have automobiles were present at its founding. The fallout, however, among the free-thinking male-run publications was venomous, and she never called a second conference, instead concentrating on completing her book, which survives today, called Woman, Church, and State, and I have a slide of that. And I think that was really kind of an unusual thing that happened in the 19th century, I would say that mainly the free thought organizations were very welcoming of people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and feminists, but that was just an unfortunate thing that happened that got wiped out of history. Similarly, when I wrote a book about sexism in the Bible in 1981, which has since been updated, I did not know that I was part of a long tradition of free-thinking feminists to write about the Bible, to criticize it. And of course, I knew of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. There's a slide, and that she had written the Woman's Bible, published in 1895 and 1898, and that she had been repudiated because of it by the very women's movement she had helped to create. But I did not know that the first such critique of the Bible was published about 1878. It's called The Godly Women of the Bible by an Ungodly Woman of the 19th Century, a title that always makes me smile and was intended to, I think. And it was written by Ella E. Gibson, and there is a slide of her. And there she is. She had malaria. She was a chaplain in the Civil War who then became a freethinker. And she wrote the book, I believe, while she was bedridden. There was only one college library at the time I was doing my research back in the mid-1990s that even listed a circulating volume, and they refused to loan it to me. I was able to get a photocopy. Gibson wrote of the Bible that any family which permits such a volume to lie on their parlor table ought to be ostracized from all respectable society. Nor did I know about an elegantly written book, Men, Women, and Gods, written by Helen H. Gardner. There should be a slide, not a very good one, I'm afraid. Published in 1885 and based on a series of well-received lectures she'd given, with a foreword by Gardner's friend, Robert Ingersoll. She was dubbed Ingersoll in soprano. The book holds up even today. Gardner later became instrumental in the suffrage movement. Helen Gardner wrote, "I do not know of the needs of a God or of another world. I do know that the needs of humanity and this world are infinite, unending, constant, and immediate. They will take all our time, our strength, our love, and our thoughts, and our work here will be only then begun." So I would say it's a trademark of women freethinkers, those who write anyway, to say we need to concentrate on this world, not some unknown world, and solve our problems here. One of the reasons I didn't know about these freethinking books in many, many freethinking women writers is because the anthologies of writings of freethinkers, including into the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, were almost all entirely of male writers. Modern history scarcely mentioned any women. For example, Classics of Free Thought, edited by Paul Blanchard, which came out in 77, had only one woman entry, an interesting one, Eleanor Roosevelt. And it was actually just an exchange, a letter exchange between Cardinal Spellman and herself, in which she championed the separation of church and state and defended herself against accusations of being anti-Catholic, although she actually was a freethinker. But that was the only mention of women in that anthology. Gordon Stein's 1980 anthology of atheism and rationalism included only two women, Annie Besant, who later became a theosophist, and we have a picture of her, and then Hypatia Bradlaugh Bonner, the daughter of Charles Bradlaugh, and there's a photograph of her. And of course, they refused to seat him in Parliament twice before he finally got in as an atheist. And his daughter carried on his legacy. And both these British women from the late 19th and early 20th centuries deserved to be included, but that was it. And I don't mean to pick on Gordon Stein, but when his second anthology came out in 87, of 49 entries, it included only 3 women, Bonner, Besant, in a poem by the late 19th century freethinker Voltairine de Cleyre. So the exclusion of Elizabeth Cady Stanton is particularly an oversight because her writings really were available. She edited the Woman's Bible and wrote many memorable passages. I also, when I came to edit my anthology, I reprinted several of her magazine articles, and I ended up including a 75-page reader on her views alone because of the huge amount of verbiage she had produced against religion. Manuscripts, speeches, her diary, letters to the editor, letters to friends. It went on. And these have been largely lost to history. Stanton wrote, "My heart's desire is to lift women out of all these dangerous, degrading superstitions. And to this end will I labor my remaining days on earth." And I think, as Mandisa says, no, she wasn't perfect. And I think we all are aware of that episode in her past as well. During my research, the connection between the original feminist and suffrage movements with free-thinking women became clear. They were the first, or among the first, to call for the vote. That was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for dress reform, for educational rights, for marriage and divorce reform, and of course, contraception. Margaret Sanger and others before her. I researched and edited this first anthology of women freethinkers back in the 1990s, early 1990s, mid 1990s, before the internet and digital databases could really be that helpful. The anthology is called Women Without Superstition, No Gods, No Masters, the collected writings of women freethinkers of the 19th and 20th centuries. And just a word to put in context what these early 19th century women freethinkers were up against. Up until 160 or 170 years ago, the biblical subjugation of women was still the operative norm of Western culture, even in the United States. Women could not vote, they couldn't speak in public, make contracts, sue or be sued, sit on juries, attend colleges or universities, enter most trades or professions, no control of property or earnings. Women were not even legal guardians of their own children and were classed with children and idiots in the legal language of the day. The legal phrase for it was civil death, but its origins were strictly religious. And the New Testament decrees to keep in silence, in subjection, kept women muzzled and made any women speaking in public, writing for their rights, a target of mobs and venomous press calculated to demean and silence them. And this was, I can't go into the details, but we would see hundreds of ministerial students rushing in to hear a woman freethinker and turning off the gas lights and that kind of thing. So it was very natural that it took women rebels against religion to challenge these suffocating strictures ordained by religion. Every freedom for women, small or large, from wearing bloomers to riding bicycles to not having to wear bonnets in churches, that was a huge controversy, to attending universities, and of course, voting, was opposed by the churches. And we owe the rights that women have today to the many voices speaking out against such religious oppression. And these calls were initiated either by non-religious women or by very unorthodox women, including Quakers. And this is a debt to non-believers that our modern women's movement has not properly acknowledged. And just a nod to the 18th century feminist freethinker Mary Wollstonecraft, and we have a slide, a deist turned agnostic who wrote the most influential book of her era, calling for equality between the sexes, and it came out, I think, in 1792. I forgot to look at the date, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And you can see her motto repeated over and over again in the book: the being cannot be termed rational or virtuous who obeys any authority but that of reason. She urged people to treat women as rational creatures. And this is a very kind of almost random survey of just a few of the 50 plus women freethinkers featured in Women Without Superstition, with no real time to discuss all their contributions. But the next slide shows Frances Wright, the first woman to challenge the New Testament by going on a speaking tour before promiscuous audiences, and that meant audiences of men and women, in 1828. And her speaking tour was actually as a result of male revivalists, and she was seeking to uplift women who were in the audience and educate them. And she urged, turn your churches into halls of science, exchange your teachers of faith for expounders of nature, fill the vacuum of your mind. Good advice, even for today. Ernestine L. Rose is next, and she was the first canvasser for women's rights on U.S. shores. came from Poland, the daughter of an Orthodox rabbi, basically an atheist by the age of 5. She gave a speech that had been lost to history in defense of atheism in 1861, which is reprinted in Women Without Superstition, in which she noted, all children are atheists, and were religion not inculcated into their minds, they would remain so. She also wrote, our life is short, and we cannot spare an hour from the human race, even for all the gods in creation. Emma Goldman, one of those early contraceptive pioneers, wrote, whoever sincerely aims at a radical change in society, whoever strives to free humanity from the scourge of dependence and misery, must turn his back on Christianity. And I'm sure today she would say turn their back on Christianity. I'll put in Susan B. Anthony too, briefly, although she wasn't as radical as her faithful coadjutant, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Privately, she wrote Stanton, while I do not consider it my duty to tear to tatters the lingering skeletons of the old superstitions and bigotries, yet I rejoice to see them crumbling on every side. She said she believed in the creed of perfect equality. Just for a change of pace, there's a slide here of George Eliot, who wrote an essay famously castigating clergy as the most irresponsible of talkers. And Lucy Parsons, a Chicago radical who edited 2 periodicals, Freedom and Liberator, was a non-believer, and she gave a speech in 1889 called The Religion of Humanity. I tried and could not find that speech, but I did have some quotes from it, including, we have heard about a paradise behind the moon. We want something now. We are tired of hearing about the golden streets of the hereafter. What we want is good paved and drained streets in this world. As 20th century author Ruth Hermans Green wrote, let us use our energies and our initiative to solve our problems without relying on prayer and wishful thinking. When we have faith in ourselves, we do not need to have faith in God's. This anthology, very dated now, came out in 1997, more than 20 years ago. So I'm working with a co-editor on a Women Without Superstition Volume 2 to capture the really exciting contributions of the huge diversity of women, and that actually today includes some trans women, to the free thought movement and free thought writings. And I hope, Mandisa, it will include an entry by you. We'll be getting in contact with you. And Mandisa, of course, is now carrying a torch as principal founder of Black Nonbelievers, yet another free thought association run and founded by a woman. There's also Robin Blumner, a writer and journalist, serving as president of Center for Inquiry. I'm co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Sarah Haider co-founded and was president of Ex-Muslims of North America. There are so many women, authors, bloggers, and activists at all levels in our movement today. I do not think our voices will be silenced in history in the future, I hope. We are being read in the anthologies. We are being seen in conferences. Women freethinkers not only made history, however lost it was, but we are continuing to make history. And it is very natural that women, despite the historic dangers, muzzling, persecution by the church and others, would have been among the earliest leaders of secular groups and continue to be leaders. The only true shield standing between women and the Bible, that handbook of women's subjugation, is a secular government. We also see, of course, around the world, women freethinkers speaking out against Islam, including Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Marianne Namazi, and countless others who know that secularism is the answer. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Annie Laurie. Very informative. All right, well, I'm the third speaker, and again, I'm Fred Edwards. I served as executive director of the American Humanist Association from 1984 to 1999, as editor of the Humanist magazine from 1995 to 2006, and as national director of the United Coalition of Reason from 2009 to 2015. I was also president of Camp Quest, the summer camp for free-thinking children, from 2002 to 2005, and I'm currently a Humanist Celebrant Emeritus with the Humanist Society. All right, let's put up my first slide now. To understand the history of the American Humanist Association, it's necessary to begin before the beginning. The European Renaissance first brought the term humanism into vogue when many of the literary, philosophical, and scientific works of the ancient world were rediscovered and disseminated via the printing press. This eventually led to the intellectual and political foment of the 18th century Enlightenment, one product of which was the United States of America with its secular government. Next slide. The newness of the United States, next slide, yeah, there we are. The newness of the United States made it a hotbed of experimentation in the 19th century, particularly in the areas of literature, religion, philosophy, science, political ideology, economic theory, and social reform. There were reform movements for the abolition of slavery, the enfranchisement of women, labor, public health, public education, and so on. American freethinkers were among the leaders in all of these, as you have already been shown. Regarding the anti-slavery movement, Christian churches in the South opposed abolitionists, while Christian churches in the North ignored them. This caused a high level of anti-clerical rhetoric among the abolitionists, like secular activist Frederick Douglass. As a result, abolitionists were commonly derided by the public as atheists. How ironic it is then that today the abolition of slavery is viewed in the popular mind as one of the great accomplishments of Christianity. Next slide. Then out of Reform Judaism, free religion and free thought came ethical culture. From its founding by Felix Adler in 1877, it regarded social reform as a primary mission and notions of God as irrelevant. Thus, by the end of the century, it had launched a number of important programs and initiatives, such as the Legal Aid Society and campaigns against child labor. In the 20th century, the ethical culture movement helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the American Civil Liberties Union. Next slide. Meanwhile, from the beginning of the 20th century, an increasing number of liberal religious people, freethinkers, and academic philosophers began using the term humanism again, this time to describe their human-focused naturalistic worldview. Around the time of World War I, two non-theistic Unitarian ministers, John Dietrich and Curtis W. Reese, joined together to promote humanism as a movement within Unitarianism. There it grew, as well as in academic circles, until the Humanist Fellowship was founded in 1927 at the University of Chicago, which became the Humanist Press Association in the 1930s, which reemerged as the American Humanist Association in 1941. Next slide. On the world scene, following World War II, three prominent humanists became first directors of major divisions of the United Nations. Julian Huxley of UNESCO, Brock Chisholm of the World Health Organization, and John Boyd Orr of the Food and Agriculture Organization. In post-war Europe, humanist secular organizations sprang up in a number of countries. And then in 1952, at the Municipal University of Amsterdam, Huxley chaired the first international humanist gathering. Over 200 humanist leaders from around the world met and formed the International Humanist and Ethical Union. Today, this organization, now renamed Humanists International and representing over 5 million humanists worldwide, is involved in social action projects in various parts of the developing world and is active in the Council of Europe and the United Nations. Next slide. For the American Humanist Association, activist involvements emerged almost from its origin in 1941. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, AHA humanists were involved in numerous civil liberties, birth control, and environmental protection cases tried in court. One of the most prominent of these humanists was Corliss Lamont, a philosopher who successfully stood up to the House Un-American Activities Committee and Senator Joseph McCarthy. Next slide. Another was Vashti McCollum. Her U.S. Supreme Court victory in 1948, the year I was born, by the way, in McCollum v. Board of Education, established that American public schools must be religiously neutral. In 1962, she became president of the AHA. Early in the decade of the 1960s, the AHA became the first national membership organization to endorse elective abortion. Furthermore, many of the leading abortion law reform groups that were established during this time were top-heavy with humanists. Also during the decade, the AHA and the American Ethical Union worked together to establish the rights of non-theistic conscientious objectors. Prior to this, one essentially had to be a Quaker to stay out of combat. Humanists and atheists remained in the foxholes. Next slide. AHA leaders also actively worked to establish memorial societies that offered alternatives to the traditional mortuary-controlled burial arrangements dominant at the time. As a result of this humanist advance, cremation and humanistic memorial services became more widely available and less costly. Further in this connection, in 1974, the National Commission for Beneficent Euthanasia was established as an AHA program. It issued the groundbreaking statement, A Plea for Beneficent Euthanasia, a position paper signed by medical, legal, and religious leaders. It called for a commitment and to a compassionate view toward needless suffering in dying. All of this was long before the activism of the Hemlock Society and Jack Kevorkian, and before the current movement of those lobbying for medical aid in dying legislation. Next slide. One of the things humanists have taken a particular interest in is social action programs that have been used in the past as tools of religious conversion. Thus, in the 1980s, the AHA developed Rational Recovery, a substance abuse recovery program that offered a secular alternative to the more traditional religion-based Alcoholics Anonymous. As a result, today, in many communities, the courts allow those with alcohol and drug addictions to have more choices in the selection of a substance abuse recovery program. And a newer humanistic program called Smart Recovery, organized by AHA humanists and promoted by numerous AHA chapters and affiliates, continues to spread throughout the world. Next slide. Not all humanists or free-thinking social reformers, however, have done their work through identifiably free thought or humanist organizations. A prime example of this would be, as we learned from Mandisa, Asa Philip Randolph, the leading voice of the secular wing of the civil rights movement. During World War I, he became the premier civil rights journalist and went on to unionize black sleeping car porters on the railroads, as you were told. In 1941, he organized an African-American resistance that forced President Franklin Roosevelt to end racial discrimination in the defense industry. He was planning a march on Washington. In 1948, he similarly forced President Harry Truman to end racial discrimination in the military. By thus showing the power of nonviolent mass protest, he came to be recognized by many as the father of the civil rights movement, and as such was made chairperson of the 1963 March on Washington, and he led it in the initial parade, and that was the one at which Martin Luther King Jr. was keynote speaker with his famous I Have a Dream speech. The next year, President Lyndon Johnson awarded Randolph the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and in 1970, as you've been told, the American Humanist Association honored Randolph at its national conference with the Humanist of the Year award. Next slide. Another independent reformer was Albert Einstein, who Time magazine named Person of the 20th Century at the beginning of 2000. Although almost everyone knows that Einstein was a great physicist, few know that he was a humanist social activist. Born in 1879 to free-thinking Jewish parents, he co-authored the Manifesto to Europeans in 1915, calling for an end to World War I, joined the advisory board of the First Humanist Society of New York in 1941, became chair of the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists in 1946, and published a book called Essays in Humanism in 1950. Next slide. As his last act, Einstein joined Welsh mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell in the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, issued 66 years ago on July 9th, 1955, which warned of the perils that have arisen as a result of the development of weapons of mass destruction and calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons along with an end to war. The document closed with the unifying words that we appeal as human beings to human beings. Remember your humanity and forget the rest. In other words, to set aside nuclear weapons and have peace and prosperity rather than have us all die together. This document was signed additionally by leading scientists of the time, including Herman J. Muller, later the 1963 Humanist of the Year and President of the AHA, and Linus Pauling, the 1961 Humanist of the Year. Its issuance led directly to the emergence of the modern anti-war movement. Next slide. Clearly, the advancement of society has been central to humanism. This spirit was prominent in Humanist Manifesto 2, the 20th century's leading humanist document released by the American Humanist Association in 1973. As the AHA prominently opposed the rise of the religious right and its advocacy of public school creationism during the late 1970s and through the 1980s, next slide, it was joined by world-renowned author Isaac Asimov, who received the Humanist of the Year award in 1984 and was elected AHA president in 1985. Next slide. As the AHA celebrated its 50th anniversary in 1991, its national magazine, The Humanist, became a major alternative medium for social and political commentary, attracting leading authors to its pages, including Kurt Vonnegut when he was named Humanist of the Year in 1992, going on to become the AHA's honorary president. The AHA was one of the first organizations in the secular movement to become fully active online with the introduction of its website in 1995. It remains a movement leader in online and social media with hundreds of thousands of followers. Next slide. In 2002, the AHA moved its headquarters to the nation's capital, thus taking humanism to the center of power and influence. And the next year, it issued Humanism and Its Aspirations, the third Humanist Manifesto, signed by 24 Nobel Prize winners. Next slide. In 2005, the AHA board initiated the first movement-coordinated mass media advertising campaign, doing so with ads in progressive magazines. From there, the AHA launched into bus ad and billboard campaigns that went on for many years. Next slide. To ensure that the constitutional rights of humanists would be represented in court, the AHA launched the Appignani Humanist Legal Center in 2007. In 2008, humanist education got a boost with the AHA's establishment of the Kochar Humanist Education Center. In 2017, the Humanist Institute merged with the AHA and took over all the educational programs, becoming what is today the AHA's Center for Education. Over the past decade, the Center for Free Thought Equality has been the AHA's lobbying arm, and the Free Thought Equality Fund has been its political action committee that works to elect sympathetic candidates for political office. Next slide. During this same period, the AHA has expanded its efforts toward a more inclusive humanism with the Feminist Humanist Alliance, LGBTQ Humanist Alliance, Black Humanist Alliance, Latinx Humanist Alliance, and the Humanism for All project supporting humanist prison inmates. Pictured here is Gloria Steinem, who was honored as the AHA's Humanist of the Year in 2012. Now, as we look forward toward a post-pandemic era, the future is clearly wide open. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn us over to our final speaker, and that is John Leaker. He's the director of the Library and Archives at the Meadville Lombard Theological School, a Unitarian Universalist seminary in Chicago, and also the former treasurer of the Unitarian Universalist Humanist Association. John has helped establish and curates the Humanist Special Collection at Meadville Lombard, which manages archival materials from the AHA and a number of its leaders. Take it away, John.
Hello. Always want to start with a land acknowledgement. Both Meadville Lombard and the Humanist Special Collection are located in Chicago on the unceded homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi Nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, the Ho-Chunk, the Sac, and the Fox, call this area home as well. So, the Humanist Special Collection at Meadville Lombard houses archival material that documents the growth and impact of humanism. It contains personal papers of notable humanists, the records of humanist organizations, and collections centered around themes and events tied to humanism. In short, it seeks to tell the story of humanism. This collection came about due to gaps within the archival record of humanism. Secular movements are often understudied in part because of the difficulties of archival research. Unlike religious, political, or labor movements, secular movements generally don't have the same emphasis on history or communal memory, and they don't have institutions that can support that memory work. We don't keep very good records sometimes, and when we do, we don't have a place to store them. The Humanist Special Collection is an attempt to provide that place. The Humanist Special Collection is also a community archive. Community archiving is, at its core, an approach to archiving that acknowledges the centrality of community in generating archival records, maintaining historical memory, and knowing what to do with both. As a community archive, the Humanist Special Collection is guided by a steering committee of humanists who help decide what collections to acquire, how to catalog them, and how to make them useful to the humanist and secular community. Core to this collection is the American Humanist Association records. Acquired in 2 large chunks about 5 years ago, the AHA records document the history of the AHA from its founding to the early 2000s, with the bulk of the material between the 1940s and the 1970s, consisting of 37 full-size banker boxes. It includes board minutes, memos, correspondence, pamphlets, and files on all the annual meetings. It also includes records of many local humanist chapters created during the middle part of the 20th century. There are many essential stories contained in these records, but I want to talk about 3 different ways these records can be approached. An important and often overlooked approach is the institutional story. Humanist history tends to focus on ideas and activism, but often misses the structures that support those ideas and activism. The AHA was formed in 1941 when Curtis Reese and John Dietrich reorganized the Humanist Press Association into the American Humanist Association. This early organization, well, organization is a strong word for it in 1941. This group of people attached to a dying publisher scrambled to organize and survive. But they did, and they slowly grew the AHA into a stable organization. It began to publish the Humanist magazine, and it grew in size and complexity enough to start, the AHA was able to support legal cases by the late 1940s, including working with Vashti McCollum. By the late 1960s, there was an increase in professionalization of the AHA, with expanding staffing and a more robust public presence. By this time, the AHA was strong and stable enough to do many of the things it does to this day, such as supporting humanism as an intellectual tradition, acting as a locus of secular activism, and maintaining a sense of community among humanists and other secular folk across the United States and the larger world. Institutional histories don't have to be dry and boring. Looking at how the AHA functioned and built itself is an opportunity to see how power works, to see how humanist organizations are funded, and to see how ideas and institutions support each other and struggle against each other. This institutional history is a way of looking at how movements are built and maintained. In our current moment, this is critical knowledge to have. This institutional framework is also important for the next 2 possible areas of study: the AHA's activism and the AHA's role in building humanist community. One really fruitful area of study is the AHA's activism during the middle part of the century. The AHA's public advocacy went beyond just maintaining the separation of church and state, but included reproductive rights, civil rights, and responding to the cultural sea change of the late 1960s. During the 1970s, the AHA released statements in support of LGBTQ rights, and during the 1980s, the AHA publicly took on the religious right. A major tool for the AHA's activism was the Humanist magazine. With a wide and growing circulation throughout the 20th century, it became home for humanist news and a major place for activists, thinkers, and artists to share their ideas, lift up important events, inform humanists about exciting new ideas and concepts. Some of the most interesting documents in the AHA records relate to the Humanist magazine. There are so many letters to the editor, and they are as cranky and as fascinating as you would imagine. While looking at legal cases, public statements, and back issues of The Humanist, you can get a pretty good idea of what the AHA was doing for advocacy. But what the AHA records provide is insight into how those statements were generated, what internal dynamics led to certain issues being emphasized and others not. It also provides enough context to ask bigger questions. How did the AHA's legal strategy differ from the ACLU's? How did the Cold War impact the AHA's work? What less public activism was the AHA doing through lobbying and other forms of advocacy? Internally, what did it feel like for the AHA staff to be under attack in the 1980s? For me, the most important way to approach the history of the AHA is not through the institution and not through the activism, but it's to explore how the AHA reflects and relates to the larger humanist and secular communities. Sometimes in the popular imagination, the history of humanism gets reduced to a list of brave people, nearly always white men, generating ideas. And the role of history becomes how to trace how those ideas connect. Often this way of history is attached to a model of continual progress. Each thinker building on what went before, creating a better, more accurate, more just understanding of the world. While not unique to humanism, this model of progress does connect to certain deep impulses within humanism and other free thought movements. It's very easy to combine this approach to evolutionary thinking and a belief in ever-proving technology and science. To imagine humanist history in this way is to miss so much. It's an incredible exclusionary approach. Not only is it generally dominated by men, it tends to be wealthy white men who write books. This is a tiny slice of human experience and a tiny slice of humanism. This great man approach to history also obscures the oppressive structures that gave these men power and privilege to have such an impact and to get to be remembered. By remembering humanist history in this way, we often end up reinforcing these structures. How can the AHA records solve this? Well, this is a much bigger issue than a single archival collection can solve. But I think the AHA records contain seeds, contain possibilities of research that can grow into solutions. First, a community approach can better understand the institutional structure and advocacy work of the AHA that I talked about earlier. The American Humanist Association is not operating in a vacuum. And as a member-based organization, it responded to its members in the larger secular community. The leaders of the AHA, the authors of the Humanist Press, and many of the Humanists of the Year are not separate from this community. When looking at these figures, we should understand them in the context of the web of relationships that they were in with each other, and not solely as atomized individuals thinking thoughts. A good example of this approach is a closer look at the Second Humanist Manifesto. Written in 1973 by Edwin Wilson and Paul Kurtz, primarily, the Second Manifesto was created as a response to some of the optimism and utopian tone of the First Manifesto. Unlike the First Manifesto, after it was written, the general public could add their names to the manifesto. Thousands did. Looking at the records, I got the distinct impression the AHA was not expecting so many people to want to sign the Second Manifesto. I came across thousands of note cards bundled together and stored on a Budweiser cardboard flat of all the people mailing in their signature, their name, where they're at in their jobs. Thousands of regular, normal people saw this manifesto, found it meaningful, and wanted to add their name to it. And this really made clear to me that the AHA is connected to a much larger community that we often don't think about or don't incorporate in some of our historical analysis. And I think these thousands of people, their stories and their perspectives can be as interesting, fruitful, informative, and important as the famous people that signed it first. Another part of the AHA records that can help create a better understanding of the AHA is the Humanist chapter files. These are some of my favorite records. Created by a small group of humanists in the 1950s and continuing to this day, these chapters function, especially originally, as part book club, part hub of community organizing, and part social club. Those people making community and finding meaning together. I love reading these groups because they reflect a lived humanism that often gets obscured. A community-based archive approach can give us insight into how humanism is lived, not just as a philosophy, but as a life stance, and we can understand it as it is actually lived in people's lives. These chapters really give us an insight into this. This bottom approach can also begin the work of understanding how the AHA intersects and the humanism with American history. These chapters weren't divorced from larger trends in US history. How are they responding to the issues of the day? When did they make positive change? When did they fall short? What do they tell us about those localities? I think this history is particularly relevant today, with the rise of new forms of humanist and secular communities popping up across the world. This isn't the first time we have done this, and there can be wisdom in the past. There can also be lessons from mistakes made. History is not purely an academic, backward-looking exercises. It can have real impact on possible futures. Finally, maybe most importantly, these humanist chapters better reflect the diversity of humanist and humanism. A bottom-up community approach can show that humanism is not and hasn't been an exclusively white upper class movement, despite that often being the public-facing side of humanism during much of this time. Going through the thousands of people that signed the Second Manifesto, you'll find people of all walks of life, finding meaning in the manifesto and wanting to add their names to this list to join this community. A community-based approach also shows the impact of African-American humanists upon the AHA. As Mandisa showed here tonight, there is a rich and long tradition of humanist thought and practice in African-American communities. A look at humanist communities in the 20th century shows that the tradition of African-American humanism has had a significant impact on the AHA. While not part of the AHA records, a good example of this dynamic is in the Humanist Special Collection is the life and work of Louis McGee, an ordained Unitarian minister and a member of the board of the AHA in the 40s. As a Black man, he received tepid support in his attempt to lead both humanist and Unitarian communities. Despite that, after he graduated Meadville Lombard, he founded an integrated Unitarian congregation with a humanist emphasis, the Free Religion Fellowship on the south side of Chicago in the 1950s. After growing that congregation, he was hired by the American Humanist Association, where his primary job was to act as a connection between the AHA and the humanist groups and chapters. The lessons he learned on the south side of Chicago were used to help support and build the earliest humanist chapters and communities across the United States. This isn't to say that the history of race and humanism is a triumphant one. Looking at the AHA during its early founding and organizing, we can also see the impact of white supremacy culture. A colorblind, often simplistic approach to racial justice informed much of how the AHA and white humanists approached racial injustice. In addition, folks like Louis McGee were rare in the early history of the AHA. African Americans were and are underrepresented in leadership and membership in humanism. McGee, an experienced, highly educated and qualified leader with decades of experience, when he worked for the AHA, building these communities, his title was administrative assistant. It is important we tell all the stories, good and bad. Engagement with AHA history, from tracing how the AHA was organized and grew, to its public activism and advocacy, to the growth of humanist communities across the United States, is vital work. As I've said before, history is not purely an intellectual exercise. It provides case studies to help us know what works and doesn't work. I think most importantly, it builds community. To remember one's ancestors is a deeply human drive and is common across nearly all cultures. Often, however, it is described and understood in metaphysical terms and it's embedded within religious practice. I think it should become a humanist practice grounded in the discipline of history, but also made meaningful and useful for the larger humanist community. I also think you all should do it. And I mean you as the people attending this. An important part of community archiving is that archives are not just for academic researchers, but for the community to use it as a tool to understand themselves, the past, and to make meaning with the knowledge in the archive. Soon, the Humanist Special Collection will begin a digitization project funded by the AHA and the Humanist Foundation, and we'll start putting these early records online for researchers to access anywhere in the country free of charge. Beyond that, we have 2 archivists at Meadville Lombard who are here to answer any specific questions you have. And if you can't make it to Chicago to access the records that we have yet to digitize or can't digitize, we can do ad hoc scans for you. The point of the Humanist Special Collection isn't for me to take the documents, put them in a box and say, isn't it really cool we have them? It's to make them useful for humanists, to engage in research, to start filling in the gaps in our history, and start understanding the past and making it meaningful and useful to the present. Thank you.
All right, excellent. I'd just like to make a quick comment about something you said, John, when you pointed out about how the rank and file humanists in the chapters were often more diverse than in the national organization. Well, I remember when I attended the Reason Rally in 2012, and I saw this incredibly diverse crowd. And I looked at that and I thought, where did all of these people come from? I mean, they weren't like the faces I was looking at board meetings and things like that. So that was a great change. All right, well, anyway, I want to thank our panelists for their presentations and thank you, our attendees, for joining us tonight to learn some of the history of secularism, humanism, and the American Humanist Association on our 80th anniversary conference. Now the remaining time in our program is for you. This is where your questions get asked, and we're all direct to the most appropriate panelist or panelists your questions. So again, let's bring in Nicole Carr to begin our Q&A by telling us what some of the questions are.
Thank you, Fred. And that was a wonderful presentation on everybody's part. I've been at the AHA on staff for 4 years, and I learned lots of new things. So thanks for sharing that. I'm going to start with one question that was actually posted before the talk started. This is from Shristi Huku, and she asks, what is the role of intersectionality in humanism?
Who wants to take that one on? And can the question be interpreted a little more clearly so that we can answer it better? Intersectionality in what sense?
Well, I think intersectionality is generally understood to be the places where our sort of different identities connect. Our racial identities or our sex and gender identities, or maybe Mandisa or Annie Laurie wants to jump in.
Well, I kind of didn't want to be the first person to respond to that because that's usually, I'm usually one of the first to be called on. So I think it's very clear that considering the commitments to education that were pointed out previously, and the factors that also impact marginalized communities, people of color, women, the trans community, the LGBTQ community, and then they're probably repeating myself there, but as humanists and our commitment to, evidence and, information and education, it is important that, like I said during my talk, that our activism and our advocacy extend beyond the church state or state church separation, because it's important to understand how these things adversely affect the economically disadvantaged, how again they affect our our reproductive justice efforts, and also how historically the role of religion and Christianity in particular has been in white supremacy, which, as stated before, many of the institutions have benefited from, and have been at the cost or at the expense of people of color, the rank and file. I still consider myself rank and file. I'm still volunteer in this movement. So that says a lot. And so understanding how all of these things impact us, whether directly or indirectly, and our ability to see the world beyond our indoctrinated belief systems is very, very important, because it's supposed to expand your worldview and expand your mind.
All right, and by the way, on that intersectionality, I'm thinking about, too, the work I used to do with the United Coalition of Reason, where my job was to go around the country and get local groups in our movement, regardless of what national organization they were affiliated with, and get them working with each other. And so it didn't matter what kind of group it was. It could be, a congregational group. It could be an identifiably atheist group. It could be, affiliated with black, free thinkers and so forth. And it could, it can be any one of these groups. And so I was trying to get these groups talking to each other, and that added to a lot of cooperation. And then, as I mentioned earlier, what happened at the Reason Rally and what happens at AHA conferences as well.
Fred, we have a question that kind of speaks to what you just brought up. Dave Rice asks, can someone speak to efforts by AHA and local chapters to better integrate with UU churches, especially those aligned with the UU Humanist Association?
Yeah, and the easy answer to that is that you look at the UU churches in your area. Any given group can look at the UU churches in their area and see what their emphasis is. Different congregations have a different character and emphasis. And if you find that they are humanist or atheist welcoming congregations, or they have a subgroup within their membership that identifies as humanist or atheist or free thought or whatever, well, they can connect with those subgroups or with the minister themselves and just do it. They can contact the AHA as well, or they can go to the United Coalition of Reason, which has its website. But the easiest way is just to do it yourself, to just contact any group you want to connect with and let them know you exist and learn more about who they are.
Another question, this is actually two questions. I'll ask them one at a time. How about that? From Marty Shoemaker. People say that putting together humanist groups is like herding cats. Do the records show that we are quite anti-authority and resist structure?
John, that's for you.
Yes, there is always that challenge. I also think it was more pronounced in the Earth like, what does humanist community look like? So a lot of time you see in these groups is how do you build practices around community that don't rely on religious language or norms or concepts, but at the same time are meaning making, are ways to be with people, are ways to resolve conflict, are ways to be in relationship. And you can't think your way out of that problem, right? It's a relational dynamic that a lot of chapters and anybody that does community organizing realize this as well. It's not like you can't like find the right guidelines or the right rule book and that will fix all of the problems. So I think sometimes the humanist impulse in the records is if you can just think your way through it or debate your way through it, you can have a nice coherent community. It never works that way. So you do see that that impulse in the records. But I also think that feistiness is also useful when they are doing some organizing, they get pushback. That can be a useful thing. It's not enough, but it is good to kind of have that feistiness and that independence and that kind of gumption when things get difficult. But you definitely need that to be balanced with other communal aspects.
Yeah, it's often when I've worked with local chapters, it's often they welcome in a lot of the social misfits or the people who nobody else likes or whatever, or who are rebels and radicals and they can't find a group, and then the humanists or the atheists or whomever becomes their group. Of course, it must be a real downer to then be rejected by them. But anyway, next question, Nicole.
Again, from Marty Shoemaker. The question is, are there any records of the interface between AHA and Humanist Canada historically?
Yes. Yeah, there's plenty of records that we held 2 conferences jointly with them, one in the United States in Seattle and one in Montreal in Quebec. And so, and we've interacted in various other ways with our celebrant programs, coordinating those. And we've gotten to know each other. Many of our speakers have spoken in Canada. Many of their speakers have spoken in the United States. And Don Page, an editor in Canada of Humanist in Canada, was once editor of the Humanist magazine. So we've had some interface, not a lot, not as much as maybe we would have liked, but nonetheless, we did keep up a continuing dialogue over all the years I was involved in leadership.
Fred, I think this one may be directed at you since I believe it was you that mentioned Einstein in your presentation. What was Einstein's answer to explain his role in helping develop nuclear weapons?
Oh, well, that's kind of a famous thing, is that his role wasn't the development of nuclear weapons. His role was to inform the government that Germany was in the process of developing a nuclear weapon. And what the plan was these leading scientists, one of them who was a leader in the American Humanist Association, went to Albert Einstein and said, look, you're a big name, you're a famous name, people will listen to you. And so they gave him the information on what Nazi Germany was doing in the developing of a potential nuclear weapon. And so then Einstein presented that information to the government in a way that they would listen. So it was a passing on of information. It wasn't Albert Einstein developing nuclear weapons.
Phil Oliver asks, do you know of Etta Semple, prominent Kansas freethinker of the 19th century? And Phil would like you to know that Kansas freethinker is not an oxymoron.
Annie Laurie, that looks like for you.
Yes, and Etta Semple, of course, she's in Women Without Superstition. There's a chapter on her, and she was very interesting. I don't have the days in front of me. I think 1880s and 90s, maybe 1870s and 80s. And she was known for opening a home that would take in anybody, including fallen women, and was controversial. She was against capital punishment. She was in support of all kinds of radical things there in Kansas, which used to be radical. And when she died, it was on the front page of the newspaper, good deeds of a good woman, and they suspended the city government and courthouses to attend her funeral. So she was very radical. There was an attempt on her life, but she was beloved.
All right.
And a freethinker, of course.
Wayne Harris asks, does AHA have board members at large to represent different parts of the country?
The members elect the board, and different people run for the board, and therefore there's a nominating committee that attempts to put on the board diversity in the form of not only racial, sexual diversity, but also from various parts of the country. So over the course of the decades, the American Humanist Association has had people from all over the country serve on its board of directors, except maybe from Wyoming, but that's because nobody lives there. But in any case, yes, there is that attempt to be diverse, but it isn't that people come to the board representing their part of the country or their particular group or whatever. They're there to serve the association and its fiscal needs and so forth.
Something just I like an observation I've seen when looking at the records about humanist geographic distribution, and some real questions we need to ask about that is that the growth of humanist chapters also closely aligned with white flight, and also aligned with the post-war boom around like college towns. And so there's this connection between where humanist chapters are and humanist distribution with the rise of white flight and increased funding of like scientists and educators during the Cold War. You can map those expansions onto where the humanist chapters are. So the geographic distribution and looking closely, that's actually a really, I think, fruitful avenue of study for understanding the growth of humanism and what that meant for how different humanist communities could even possibly grow. That's a very under-researched thing that I see it in the background in a lot of the records, and if you kind of look at the history broadly, you see it there, but it's hard to quite put your finger right on it. But the geographic location of humanists is tied to a lot of other things that are worthy of study and analysis.
How do you think the virtual world is going to affect all that? In other words,
Virtual,
go ahead.
well, they have done, this report came out recently that they're looking at areas that have low internet speeds, and those are the same communities that were redlined in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So just because you move towards digital doesn't remove the same structural problems that are going to limit access to humanist knowledge and humanist community. If you don't have reliable internet, it's not fast enough to stream, that is a barrier to access. And as with many things in the United States, that barrier to access generally falls along racial and class lines. The redlining impacts your internet speed.
Yes, but we do have diversity in cities where there is good internet, and that does expose more people to humanism. I mean, the internet has been a boon to people finding humanism and then finding out that they themselves are humanists. Just like the radio made it possible for people to find rock and roll music because white teenagers started listening to black rock and roll musicians and they discovered their music. So technology does tend to spread some things around, even if it doesn't do things perfectly. All right, Nicole, what else you have?
I have one last question here, and it's for Mandisa. Well, actually, it's for anyone, but I think Mandisa has already answered it partially. Does anyone have any recommendations for books to read about BIPOC humanists, free thinkers, atheists?
Yes, so I did post a link in the chat previously. On Black Nonbelievers website, we do have recommended reading and viewing part of the, and also during my presentation, I referenced Black Freethinkers by Christopher Cameron, Humanists in the Hood by Sikibu Hutchinson. I would also recommend the Ebony Exodus Project by Candace Gorham, who was also one of the 5 Fierce Humanists. And also there are, I would also say When Colorblindness is Not the Answer by Dr. Anthony Penn, who is a former board member of the American Humanist Association, and he is also with the Institute for Humanist Studies.
And a professor at Rice University.
Yes.
All right, Annie Laurie, what do you have on that?
Well, I was going to say Chris Cameron and Sikivu Hutchinson are going to be speaking at FFRF's convention in November, and we're going to be in person. We're going to be brave in Boston, along with Gloria Steinem and Margaret Atwood, Humanists of the Year. But in terms of discovering somebody I hadn't known about, Nella Larson was a writer in the 1920s, 30s, and she wrote the book Passing, which is being turned into a movie, Harlem Renaissance. And now the name is escaping me. Her second novel, the whole novel is about a young Black woman who is not religious, who hates religion, who's in a religious, she has to go to a college where there's prayers and chaplaincies and things. And then somehow she ends up marrying a preacher and going to the deep South and suffering and then getting out of it. And it's full of passages that are ringing free thought criticism of religion. And so that needs to be looked up. And I'm sorry, the name is escaping me. And there are a lot of, Octavia Butler, sci-fi was not religious, looking at Black women writers in the 1980s, 90s. But I think that one is very fascinating, Nella Larson.
Well, Ursula Le Guin is a science fiction and other type of writer who has seeming free thought sympathies. And well, there are just a number of people. It's almost like you can Google the concept and all sorts of things start popping up. You'd be surprised when you really start searching on the internet for things you want to find that you don't think are there. It's amazing how many things pop up that you had no idea about. You just have to find creative ways to look for them and maybe use more than one search engine. Yes, Annie?
One other thing, which I had missed when I put together Women Without Superstition, is Zora Neale Hurston, of course. and she has an essay, devastating essay critique on prayer. And Norm Allen put together an anthology of Black humanism, which probably you're familiar with. And actually her essay is in that. So her writing, of course, gorgeous.
All right, do any of the other panelists have anything they'd like to add?
Oh, Fred, I did get one more question.
All right, we'll take it.
Larry Taylor is asking, John, how can I donate a book or box to the Humanist Archive?
Wonderful question. So you can send me an email at archives@meadville.edu, and then we'll chat with you and we can assess the collection and figure out how to give it a good home. We please don't send things without reaching out to us first, but we always are interested in acquisitions if they fit the collection development policy. And I'll also bring any possible acquisitions to the Humanist Steering Committee to get their feedback on that as well. But yes.
You should also be able to, just to give a plug to our conference platform, you should also be able to reach out to John through his speaker profile. If you go to attendees and search for John Leaker, you can send him a message.
All right, well, I think we're out of time, but I want to thank all of you for your participation.